Good morning, everyone. Welcome, welcome. Absolute pleasure to be with you this morning. Welcome to today's webinar, which is titled Bias Disrupted, the Psychology of Bias in the Workplace. My name is Yasmine. I am the Director of Transformation at Media Zoo, and we are a learning and communications agency. And in my role as Director of Transformation, I'm really fortunate enough. I feel so lucky to be able to support our clients in transforming their cultures. And essentially, this is often centered around diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. Now, I know a lot of us have been witnessing what has been happening around the world, and especially in the US, in the last few days. But for me, this means that the focus on DEI has to be stronger than ever, which is why I'm so thrilled to be presenting to you today about probably one of my favorite topics to talk about, which is unconscious bias. And it's one of my favorite topics because it impacts every single one of us every single day, often without us realizing it. Now, you may have joined this webinar because you also have a really vested interest in unconscious bias, and maybe you've studied it a lot, you've trained in it, you kind of recognize it in yourself. Maybe you've never done that exploration into unconscious bias and maybe whether you have it. Every time I run training on unconscious bias, whether it's a face-to-face workshop or it's a webinar, one of the main questions I get is, do I have unconscious bias? I want to see if I've got it. And I can give you a spoiler alert already. Every single one of us has some form of unconscious bias. It's just about how much we're bringing it to our consciousness and taking steps to mitigate it. And it's really important that we unpack the topic of bias and especially understand where it can show up in our workplace experience, because only then can we start to learn how to mitigate it. And this helps us to create fair and inclusive workspaces. So it's a super crucial topic, probably more crucial than ever, which is why I'm so pleased that some of you are joining us today. And I know a lot of you will be watching on catch up as well. If you are watching on catch up, I'll be giving you details at the end of the webinar on how to connect with me on LinkedIn or email me at MediaZoo, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that are left unanswered. Today's webinar is going to be a short one, but we're going to cover some crucial topics. So what do we mean by bias? Maybe we need to start there. We don't even really know what bias is. Where does bias come from? So what's kind of a bit of the psychology behind it? Where is it kind of originating from? Why does it persist? Thinking about why bias in the workplace matters and why it's important that we consider where bias shows up in the workplace. I'm going to give you some information around the most common types of workplace bias. So there are loads and loads of different types of unconscious bias, but what are some of the ones that we can look out for most in the workplace that come up time and time again? You'll probably recognize a lot of these that come up on a daily basis. And thinking finally about ways we can disrupt that bias. So when we start to become more aware of bias, what are some things that we can put in place to kind of catch bias in its tracks and start to mitigate it? So, as I've already said, it's important that we focus on bias in the workplace, as it is as prevalent today as it's ever been. And I personally think the case for focusing on DEI and bias in the workplace today is more relevant in 2025 than it's ever been. So you can see here a statistic from a recent report that Deloitte released is that 64% of employees feel they had witnessed bias at work. And I think that phrase witnessed at work is interesting because that only covers the stuff that we're noticing. What about all of the biases that we don't see that are kind of going on under the surface? Because bias, both conscious and unconscious, is still one of the most significant barriers to achieving true inclusion and equity in the workplace. But what is bias? And why does it matter so much, especially when we're talking about it in the context of work? Well, bias refers to a preference or a prejudice, often unconscious, that affects our judgment. So think of it as a mental shortcut that our brain takes to process information quickly and automatically, because usually this is happening unconsciously on an automatic level. So these are shortcuts our brain takes in order to be helpful. And in some contexts, it is helpful. So think about when you're commuting to work, whether you drive to work or whether you take public transport. Most of the time, we get to work and we don't really remember the details of how we got there. And that's because our brains are mostly on autopilot. And that's a great thing because it means we're saving the energy on a route that we know really, really well, right? It's a mental shortcut. That's really useful for us. And our mind is programmed to categorize our experiences for quick reference at all times of the day. This allows us to be able to make quick decisions. And really, this is the basis for where all and any bias starts to creep in. So some of you may have read or you may have heard of a book called by Daniel Kahneman, which is called Thinking Fast and Slow. So in this book, he talks about fast and slow thinking. And these are two different processes for how our brain makes decisions. And you can see here on screen that our fast thinking brain, which can be responsible for up to 90% of our decision making, is fast, it's automatic, and it's subconscious. Whereas our slow thinking brain needs to be slow, effortful, and logical. Now, because our brain is making around 35,000 decisions a day, it makes sense that we have a system to processes a lot of these decisions automatically and quickly. But because we're making a lot of decisions quickly and automatically, these decisions are very prone to bias. And more worryingly, they're prone to bias we don't even notice. So, where does this bias come from? Now, the first thing to understand is that bias isn't inherently bad. It's a byproduct of how our brains are wired. Now, some of you will know that to survive as part of our evolution, we had to develop mental shortcuts which make us assess threats and make decisions quickly. So think back to that fast and slow thinking brain. These mental shortcuts help us save energy. So imagine if you had to think about 35,000 decisions every day and you really actively thought through every one of those decisions. You'd be exhausted, you wouldn't be able to function, and your body wouldn't have the energy to do all of the other things that it's supposed to be doing. So these shortcuts that are sometimes referred to as heuristics are created to make us more efficient, but they're often flawed. Now, going back to Daniel Kahneman, research shows that these heuristics influence our decisions. So these mental shortcuts, they're influencing our decisions. One example being that we start to rely on immediate examples that come to mind that distort our judgment. So we tend to rely on things that we've recently kind of experienced to inform our next experience. That's known as recency bias, but we'll go into the different types of biases in a short while. The main thing to take away is these mental shortcuts can distort our judgment and mean that we think we're making decisions coming from a really well thought out logical place, but actually it's those mental shortcuts that are making us make not so great decisions. So that's brain heuristics. We also have our social environment. Of course, we've all grown up from a young age and we've been influenced by family, our education, media, where we grew up, what our cultural norms are. And this shapes our mental shortcuts as well, for good or for bad. And then our social influence, our social environment in turn goes on to influence how we create our mental schemas. So these are our mental frameworks that help us interpret the world. And again, these schemas can be helpful, but they also start to perpetuate stereotypes. So when we're putting people or situations into these different frameworks, it makes us start to categorize all instances in those different stereotypes. And some of you may only need to think about some opinions your parents may have had that have trickled down into the way that you view the world. And you may, on a logical level, may not even agree with that, but that may be the first place that your mind goes to when judging either people from different groups, or maybe the way that you think about money, all kinds of things. Your environment when you grow up, your family, your cultural norms, they all shape the way you perceive the world and therefore can heavily influence the bias that you have when you make decisions later in life. So, as we've talked about, some of our bias helps us to make quick, effective decisions. But bias in the workplace can be really harmful because it can lead to unfair or discriminatory behaviour. Bias can be conscious when we're aware of our prejudice, but far more often, and where it becomes problematic, it's unconscious and it's hidden even from ourselves. And that's where it starts to become a bit tricky. Because in the workplace, bias influences everything: who gets hired, who gets promoted, who gets mentored, or even down to who feels included in that team. It shapes our organizational culture and it impacts both individuals and business performance. So it really goes down to that granular detail of all the things that are happening in the workplace and the things we're making decisions about. These are affected by our bias. So you may be thinking, what are these types of bias? There are so many. I think there are approximately 150 different types of bias, but of course, I'm not going to cover them all today because we don't have that much time together. But I really wanted to run you through the top 7 biases that I think show up most often in the workplace, because I think if we can equip ourselves with the knowledge and awareness of these 7 biases, we can really start to recognize them in ourselves and others, and we can start to disrupt them and mitigate them in the workplace. So let's go through them and see if you recognize any of them in yourself, or maybe even in others, in other things that have happened. And I promise you, the more you learn about these, the more you start to see them everywhere. The first one is affinity bias. So, affinity bias leads us to favour people who we feel we have a connection or a similarity to. So, for example, attending the same university, growing up in the same town, or reminding us of some things about ourselves or someone we know and someone we like. So, a really classic example of where this shows up in the workplace is you might be interviewing for a new role, and one of the candidates has just talked about a keen interest in cycling, and you happen to be interested in cycling. So, bias means that you're not only going to feel more comfortable with this person, but you might also start to automatically look out for more positives than negatives and become naturally biased to them. And we all know that situation when we meet someone at a social event, and we find out that they grew up in the same town as us, and then you start asking, oh, did you go out to this restaurant or this bar, or that kind of thing, or someone that was in the same university as you at the same time, you start asking if you, oh, do you know that person, do you know that person, and we naturally become more connected to that person, which is great. That's how we build connections. But in the workplace, it can lead us to favor that person and overlook some of their more negative traits. Whereas someone who we don't have affinity to, we are more focused on their negative traits because we don't feel that affinity. So, a really common one, really important one to look out for. The second one is anchoring bias. So, anchoring bias, which is sometimes referred to as focalism, is a cognitive bias where an individual depends too heavily on an initial piece of information. And then subsequent judgments, we refer to that previous piece during our decision making process. So, once that a value of that anchor is set, all future negotiations, arguments, estimates, etc., are discussed in relation to the anchor. So again, if we think about interviews, because interviews are so rife for bias, because it's an instance where we don't really know anything about that person initially. So our brain is trying to use those mental shortcuts to build up a picture of who that person is. So interviews are a really, really key place where bias creeps in. So when we're thinking about anchoring bias, someone might come in for an interview and give a great interview, but they were 10 minutes late or their shirt was untucked. And that's the first thing that you see. So you're anchored to that. And then your brain is comparing everything that they say to that anchor. And obviously, that is going to have a negative impact on that person versus someone that maybe was on time and we're not viewing all of their answers through that slightly filtered negative lens. Incidentally, retailers use this bias a lot, If you've ever gone to a sale or kind of a Blue Cross sale or a Black Friday sale is actually a really great example for that. A lot of retailers show the original sales figure, put a big slash through it, and then put a new price by it. And because our brain is focused on anchoring bias, we'll see that original slashed figure and go, oh, amazing, it's so much cheaper. So we're much more likely to buy it. But if that lower sale price was just listed on its own price, we'll probably be less likely to buy it. So retailers and shops use our biases to their own advantage a lot. The next one, a very obvious one in the workplace, is authority bias. So authority bias refers to the tendency to believe what someone says or share their opinion purely because they are in a position of authority. So this can be dangerous on so many levels. It can be dangerous when dealing with internal complaints with two colleagues, for example, because the person with the more authority were more likely to believe what they say because of their seniority. And authority bias can also hinder diversity throughout the workplace, because what we tend to see in the workplace is this kind of inverted pyramid of more ethnically diverse people are at the bottom of the pyramid and less senior positions, and more non-ethnically diverse people are sat at the top. So majority groups are sitting at the top of that pyramid. So this creates a dilemma with authority bias, because we're more likely to believe people in positions of seniority and therefore are dismissing people at more junior levels, which is often more marginalized groups. So fourth, we have benevolence bias. And this is actually my favorite type of bias, because it feels like you're doing a really, really good thing, but actually you may be causing a disadvantage to someone, being extremely biased to that person. So benevolence is all about kind of doing good things, right? So it's a type of bias that involves you potentially making decisions on someone's behalf because you feel you're doing it for the right reasons. Whereas in fact, you're potentially discriminating against someone because of it. So a really good example of this would be you as a manager, you've got a really great opportunity for someone in your team to work in another country on a video project, for example, and you're thinking, well, Debbie has just come back from maternity leave and has a 6-month-old child, so she won't want to go away for a week. So I'm going to give that task to Rashid, who's single and he's on his own. Now, you may make that decision on your team's behalf, and you feel like you're doing it out of benevolence because you're trying to do something positive with other people's needs in mind. But we don't know Debbie's situation. We don't know Rashid's situation. Debbie might have actually been desperate to get away and build her career with this project, but we're taking this opportunity away from her by not giving her the chance. We also see this a lot in hiring. Again, hiring processes, it's where bias comes out a lot. When we've got two candidates and one lives 20 minutes away from work and one person's commute is an hour and a half from work. And we think, oh, that person who's living far away, they won't want to commute here. I'm going to give it to the person who is closer. We don't know about that person who is an hour and a half away. Maybe they love having that extra time in the morning so they can listen to their podcast, get juiced up for the workday. Ultimately, when we're making decisions on other people's behalves, this is called benevolence bias. So we should always be presenting those opportunities regardless of what we think the decision should be. Next, we have conformity bias. So conformity bias refers to our tendency to take cues for proper behavior in most contexts from the actions of others, rather than exercise our own independent judgment. Now, you may have also heard of the term groupthink. This is what conformity bias is. And it can often come up when we feel we're facing peer pressure, or we're trying to fit to a particular professional or social environment, or we're in a new environment and we are still trying to figure out kind of the norms of that environment. But everyone gets on board with an idea because no one really wants to go against the grain. And we see this sometimes when a company will release a very tone-deaf advertising campaign because everyone has kind of got into a boardroom and someone's made a suggestion, and then people are like, yeah, that's a great idea. And then people pile on top of the agreement with that idea. Then they release it to the public and someone points out how inappropriate it is, or it hasn't had the right messaging, and it's immediately taken down. When we see that in the press, that means probably that groupthink or conformity bias has informed that decision. Also, if you are currently watching The Traitors, which is my favourite thing on TV at the moment, you will see groupthink creep in every single time they're at the round table, and someone is pushing a narrative about another person. And if you haven't watched The Traitors, or if you don't know what I'm talking about, I would really recommend watching it on BBC One, even if it's just to watch Claudia Winkleman, who is the queen, because it's a great place to show how bias starts to creep in. Number 6 on this list is appearance bias. So appearance bias is actually a less spoken about form of workplace bias. And as the name would suggest, it includes judgments and prejudices that can be made about people based on physical attributes. And this is all encompassing. It can be race, it can be gender, age, weight, height, clothing, hair, and grooming, as well as perceived social characteristics like education, income, and cultural background. It can result in unequal opportunities and treatment in the workplace. And this bias is sometimes referred to as beauty bias. And we have a lot of research that shows there is a disproportionate amount of CEOs, male CEOs, who are over 6 foot tall. You know, for women in the workplace, there's a certain cutoff where, we have a sort of deemed bracket of spectrum of age that is acceptable for women to be in the workplace. And once women are over a certain age, there's a huge struggle in kind of getting hired and having jobs, whereas men don't experience that in the same way because of how we perceive this appearance bias in the workplace. So there is so much research that supports this, and it's a really tricky one, because if people fall outside of what we just deem the normal sphere of good appearance, that has knock-on effects because of the bias that's being applied to that person, and obviously the opportunities that they have and the treatment that they have in the workplace as well. And the final bias we have on our list is the halo horns bias. So this is similar to anchoring bias. It either gives a positive or a negative view of that person, when we focus particularly on one great feature about a person. You may know someone in your life or at work who can't do anything wrong. Everything they do is amazing. Or, you may have had a friend when you were growing up where I had one definitely, where my parents would not let me go to that friend's house, no matter how great I thought they were, no matter how hard they tried. There was obviously something about that person, about that friend, that they had decided very early doors, and there was nothing that could be done to persuade them on the positive side about that friend. So the halo effect occurs when we focus on one particularly great feature about that person, and then you view everything about that person in a positive or a halo light, which makes you think that they're more perfect than they are. And similarly to affinity and confirmation bias, this makes us overlook other information. So it skews our opinion of other aspects, including some of the more negative things. We may be more likely to overlook whether they need, to go on a performance improvement plan, for example, or, whether they've done something and had misconduct in the office, for example, on a more serious note. Sometimes these things can get dismissed, and you'll probably hear people say, oh, well, that's just that person, like that's okay, because they are seen through this kind of halo glow and they're getting praised all the time. And it can have the flip as well, right? The horns bias is that, but the opposite, everything is perceived through that negative lens. And you may personally have felt like no matter how hard you have tried, everything is kind of looked at negatively because of that bias, of that horn effect, essentially. So that is the opposite when you focus on one particularly bad feature, and it prevents you having a balanced view of that person. So 7 really important biases that come up time and time again in the office, and in the workplace. And actually, if you've ever experienced any of these or have witnessed any of these, please pop them in the chat. It'd be really interesting to hear whether this is something that is resonating with you, something you've experienced or you've witnessed yourself. Now, as I've said, there are around 150 unconscious biases every time I check this statistic, but it sort of centers around about 150. Sometimes I read it's 200, sometimes I read it's slightly less, but there are loads, is essentially the takeaway. So, how on earth do we remember them all? I'm not expecting us to go away and study all of them. But luckily for us, the Neuro Leadership Institute has done a lot of research on this and has categorized biases into a framework that helps us understand the different categories. And this is known as the SEEDS model. So SEEDS stands for similarity, expedience, experience, distance, and safety. So all the unconscious biases, in theory, fit into one of these buckets. So I'm just going to go through this quickly because it's a good framework to remember, and it's a good almost mental checklist for us to have when we're making decisions, to go through these and think, am I making any of these decisions based on one of these buckets? So first we have similarity. So people like us, we prefer people who are like us. And this is the root of affinity bias. So while I love to meet new people and I love to network and I love to get to know people and have new connections, I'm very, very conscious that when I'm making a decision about that person, I will sense check myself of, is there affinity between us? Do they look and sound like me? Did we grow up in the same place? Do we have the same sort of upbringing? Because that could be an indicator of some bias within myself towards that person. Expedience bias. So we rely on mental shortcuts that can make quick snap judgments. So here have we really got the evidence that supports this? So one example, I think a really good example here in the workplace is if you are someone that uses suppliers a lot, are you defaulting to a supplier that you've just used time and time again because it's easier? Or is that supplier really, really suitable for that work? Because sometimes we want to do that mental shortcut that feels a bit easier for ourselves. So challenging ourselves there. The third is experience. So we assume that our experience is more typical or accurate than it may be. So we think that, the experience that is going on around us is actually the experience that we are having, that we have ourselves. The way that we've been brought up, the things that we think about the world, that is the way it is. So are we making that judgment based on our own experience and how we interpret the world? Or are we making that decision based on fact and evidence? And can that be proven? Really, really important for us to have that distinction. Number four, so the D of the SEEDS model is distance bias. So we favor what is closer to us in time, space, or familiarity. So you may remember at the beginning of this webinar, I talked about recency bias. So this is an example of distance bias. So that is something that has occurred recently. So the distance is quite close to my memory. So that is something that I'm more likely to default to because that's the last thing I heard. So I'm going to believe that that is the thing. Or this occurs again, going back to hiring process, we're much more likely to remember the interview of the last person that we had. And if that person has given like a good interview, we're much more likely to go with that candidate if we don't have a proper matrix in place and proper evidence to support every candidate. We'll go into that in a short while to when we think about how we can mitigate this bias. So distance, is that bias closer to us in time, space, or familiarity? Let's sense check that. And finally, safety. So safety bias, we avoid risk, which can make us resist change or innovation. So part of our bias, because of our evolution, is wanting to keep ourselves safe. And if we are making decisions based on avoiding risk or resisting change, this can go towards a safety bias. So another thing to sense check ourselves against. Now, this SEEDS model is a really powerful tool in recognizing how different forms of bias operate and intersect. And it's a really useful model for us to sense check ourselves against making decisions that are prone to bias. Now, one thing to really understand about biases is they're not static, they're not set in stone. So neuroplasticity, which is our brain's ability to change and adapt, means our biases can evolve based on new experiences and new information. So, for example, On the plus side, exposure to diverse teams tends to reduce that implicit bias over time. However, the same can happen on the other side. So if biases are reinforced through repetition, they get stronger. So, for example, if a workplace consistently undervalues women in leadership, it normalizes the belief that men are more suitable leaders. So the key to disrupting bias is to learn how to identify them, which we've done a little bit of work on today, and then start to mitigate them. The more that we can bring those unconscious biases into our conscious and start addressing them, the more we can do to reduce bias at the workplace. And what I do, and it's a common misconception about people who are specialists in DEI and understand bias, is that they don't have bias. And that's not the case at all. In fact, all it does is it just elevates how aware I am of my own biases. And I always operate from a place of thinking, which of my biases are going to show up here? What is most likely to be coming up for me here, rather than do I have any bias? Because as I said, spoiler alert, we all have them. The good news is that bias can be challenged. And it starts with awareness. So by you being here today on this webinar, you've already done the first step. So amazing. But it doesn't stop there. So let's explore 5 ways that we can disrupt bias and start to mitigate them. So the first one is unconscious bias training. Now, I need to kind of set my stall out for unconscious bias training because I think it's got a really bad reputation recently. I know that under our previous government, they kind of poo-pooed unconscious bias training a bit. Obviously, we've got a lot of backlash for what's going on in America at the moment. But when it doesn't work is when it's a one and done scenario. So you're never going to shift the dial on anything just by having one bit of training. Studies show us that when unconscious bias training is done well and it's done frequently, it reduces bias decision making, but it must be part of a broader strategy and not a one-off session. So that is something, if you're someone who's involved in creating DEIB strategies, it's something to remember. It has to be a consistent, reinforced process, not just a one-off session. We also want to have structured processes in place. So we've talked a lot about interviews and we've talked a lot about hiring in this webinar, but when we have structure and matrices and clear criteria for interviewing, for performance, our evaluations, this reduces room for bias because everyone is being judged by the same elements. So we've seen a rise in using blind CVs in recruitment because we know that even seeing someone's name written on the top of that CV can influence whether that person gets invited for interview or not. So the more that we can do to reduce that and have due process in all of our elements when we're thinking about hiring, promotion, bonuses, all of these things in the workplace, that's going to really help disrupt bias. Diverse decision-making groups. So if we want to avoid that authority bias or that groupthink, we want to be having diverse decision-making groups. So teams that include diverse perspectives make better decisions. And this is backed up by Harvard Business Review, by McKinsey, by Deloitte. When we have diversity of thought within our groups, we are making better, less biased decisions. Feedback and accountability. So regular self-reflection and feedback systems, helping us to understand where bias may have crept in, reflecting on decisions that are being made. These are really important to bring this topic to life and help us navigate it in the workplace. And finally, you're all on this webinar, so it must mean that you have a vested interest in some way in unconscious bias. So bring that into your workplace, bang the drum about it. When you start to see these biases creep in and you can see people defaulting to an authority figure, whereas actually that decision might not be right, call it out. So having that ally to use their position to support and advocate for when bias is happening, especially against marginalized colleagues, this can help tenfold. When we're calling out someone's biased behavior, it helps everybody rise. And finally, I say this all of the time, but leaders, you need to set the tone. So if you are a leader and you are on this webinar, you have to take the reins on setting the tone on this stuff. Because if your employees see you modeling inclusive behavior, they're going to recognize it's a priority and they will do it as well. So even something as seemingly simple as volunteering your opinion last in meetings is going to minimize authority bias and groupthink. It's going to stop people defaulting to your opinion as the most valued opinion because you're the most senior person, and you don't know what amazing ideas and what amazing opinions your team has. And I've seen this time and time again, when leaders go last, they really start to minimize the bias in the decision making. Another really great thing that you can start doing in your meetings, especially if you're a leader, is to nominate a devil's advocate. So someone it is their sole responsibility to be the voice of dissent, because it helps us challenge the decisions that we're making. And that person, because they have that authority to do that, doesn't feel awkward about doing it because they've been given the power to do it, and that's almost their job. So there are a couple of things that we can do immediately, very simple, that are going to minimize bias. So to wrap up here are some key points to remember. Firstly, bias is natural, but it's not inevitable. It's something we can challenge, and it's something that we can change. So take this information, keep reading about it, and reflect for yourself. Secondly, the impact of bias in the workplace is profound. It is all around us, and it influences individuals and business outcomes. But by taking intentional steps, we can start to disrupt bias and build more inclusive and innovative organizations, and more fair and equitable organizations, which is the key part of any DEIB strategy. So, what is your call to action? Think about what you're going to start doing differently today. Are you going to speak up when you see bias? Are you going to challenge your own assumptions? Are you going to take forward some of the learning from those biases that we learned about and put into practice some strategies that we can apply to our meetings and beyond? Small actions, when multiplied, lead to transformative change. And with all of these things, it's that ripple effect of what we start to do that really pave the way for transformation. So thank you so much for tuning in today. It's been a pleasure to share these insights with you. Please feel free to put any questions in the chat box, any insights you've gained. One question, as I said, I always get asked is, what are the things that I can do to help mitigate that bias? And I really hope that some of the strategies that we went through today are going to help. But just being aware and just using that seeds model whenever we're making a decision to think, have I fallen foul of any of these areas, is really going to help you to mitigate those biases. So I've just put my details on screen. Do feel free to reach out to me at any point. You can scan the QR code on screen and that will take you to my LinkedIn page. Would love to connect with you. You can see my email address at the bottom, yasminalani@mediazoo.tv. Really happy to chat through any challenges you may have in the DEIB space. If you're watching with fright at what's going on in America and thinking about what do we do with my DEI strategy in the workplace, happy to have a chat, happy to see where you are, what your challenges are, and how we can help support you. I wish you such a wonderful rest of your day. I hope you found this session interesting and insightful. Do connect with me, and I really, really hope to see you in future webinars in the future, or other places that we can connect in real life. Imagine that. So take care, everyone. Have a great day.